Hey guys, this is Louie. Before I get started this evening, some housekeeping items first. Addiction caused me pain. I've been about 4 years clean at this point. Did a lot of different things over the years, but towards the end, it was all pretty much marijuana and alcohol. Um, I'm doing this podcast because I want to help others to avoid that pain or heal that pain by sharing things that I've learned and things that I've realized throughout my journey of both pre and post sobriety. If you listen to this tonight, or whatever time it is when you listen to it, and you found this helpful, please take a moment and share it with others who may be struggling. Rate it, review it by scrolling down to the ratings and review section in iTunes. That'll help me to get it out there to others. Ideally, I'd like to help as many people relieve that pain and suffering brought on by addiction as possible. And also the pain and suffering of those people who care about the people who are actually, embroiled in addiction. If you have questions, feedback, comments, things you'd like to hear my perspective on, potentially topics, for me to discuss, or even interest in telling your story, please shoot me an email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. So this will be episode 6. The first 5 episodes were written, and many of them were actually recorded back in September, October of 2018. It actually took me 7 or 8 months to get the courage to actually put them out there for public consumption. There's a lot to this. Not the podcast. What I mean is there's a lot to the reason behind why I hesitated for 7 or 8 months. When I recorded the first 5 episodes, it really helped me a lot. It was therapeutic and cathartic. It was good for my recovery. And for a little while, after I recorded these things, I thought that was maybe the purpose of all this. Just, to help me on my own journey. Then, after I turned those feelings and emotions over in my head and evaluated them and that kind of thing, I realized that what was going on was I was actually scared. There was fear of failure, fear of rejection, who knows. This is kind of a weird thing for me, fear of failure and fear of rejection. I've been in sales for a long time. I can call people all day long and not get anywhere. Everyone hangs up in my face. And, that doesn't faze me. But, I think that's because that's a business environment. And that isn't as close to my heart or as personal the way my recovery is. So the other part of that is, fear of failure. Well, in this case, I couldn't really figure out what success with this endeavor looked like. So, because I can't measure success, I also don't know what failure looks like. I came to the conclusion that the ultimate failure here would have been if I made these recordings and then never shared them with anyone. And consequently, there was never a chance to actually help anyone with this stuff. So, that being said, I'm 7 or 8 months further down the road. I hit 4 years of sobriety in early June. In this episode, I'm going to talk about emotions and how they intersect and interact with my addiction. My theory on why we have emotions. I'll also touch on guilt versus shame. Also, how emotions kind of jack us up and make things pretty painful and uncomfortable in the beginning of sobriety. So, over the last several years, sitting in the rooms, I've heard a lot of people tell their stories. How they got addicted, how they started their journey towards sobriety, and once achieved, what their program looked like and how they stayed on the path. A lot of times, at least somewhere along the way, sometimes constantly throughout the story, the common theme that seems to assert itself is emotions. Specifically, a lot of folks, myself included, talk about how they use their drug of choice to avoid negative emotions or perhaps enhance positive emotions. I remember one time dating this girl, and she got super pissed because every time she came over, I was high. And she couldn't understand why I was always high. And I explained the concept of being an enhancement smoker. That's a reference to Half-Baked. But how getting high makes everything better, including her. Needless to say, she didn't really appreciate that comment. That relationship didn't last very long. But specifically, emotions seem to play a role in many people's addiction. They absolutely positively did for me. If we're talking about negative emotions, it could be any number of things. Lack of confidence, feelings of inadequacy, anger, sadness, fear, anxiety. Pick your poison. Now, some of these details I'm about to go into, I mentioned in other episodes, specifically episode 1 and 2. Here's the Cliff Notes version of, kind of how my addiction ramped up. So, when I was in grade school, I'd get in trouble a lot. I didn't make good grades. I constantly got negative feedback from my parents and most of my teachers for a very long time. Consequently, I didn't feel good about myself. So when I discovered weed and alcohol when I was about 15, 16 years old, I started abusing it very quickly because for once in my life, I had discovered a way to feel happy by turning off this negative tension, these negative emotions. In a sense, by numbing myself, I became free of them. Over time, though, it became something that I had to do to feel normal. So it wouldn't bring me happiness. I wouldn't feel good. I would just feel normal when I would use. And that was when my addiction had me in its vile clutches, basically. At that point, it was all over. For a while, I just thought that getting high and drunk and later using other things, like I said, I just did it to feel good. And for a while, maybe it actually did feel good. I did used to be happy in the beginning. But after a while, I realized that I would get triggered to use by strong emotions. An example of this would be if I was stressed out or got angry or nervous or even scared or felt anxiety, I'd get the urge to get high or drunk or whatever I could get my hands on. In short, strong negative emotions triggered my desire to use. It could be a fight with the boss, fight with the girlfriend, maybe I got fired from a job, whatever. My response to strong negative emotions was to turn them off by numbing myself with drugs and alcohol. It was how I coped with things. And really the problem with that is it's not sustainable. If you numb yourself, you don't actually solve the problem. It just goes away. You just don't feel it for a while. And then when you sober up, it's still there waiting. Many times it's even worse. But we'll get into that in a little bit, how it relates to solving problems. I think that is also one of the most difficult things when we come back to being sober from using. Aside from physical issues like withdrawal, depending on what you were using, the fact is that many of us aren't used to feeling those emotions. And all of a sudden, there they are at full force whatever day we decide to get sober. And the emotions are 2 inches from our face, and we can't run, we can't hide, we can't get away. And because of our habit of just shutting them off by using, we're also ill-equipped to deal with those emotions. Because we stopped using and now we're forced to feel them and deal with them. And like I said, for many of us, we hadn't felt or dealt with any emotions in years. I guess it's almost like being locked in a dungeon for years. In an environment where you get very little artificial light and no sunlight. And then all of a sudden, you're released from the dungeon, you go out on a bright sunny day very quickly with no time for your eyes to adjust. The light is going to be very overwhelming and very blinding and also very painful because you're not used to it. That is something I could relate to. That's something I've experienced. Another analogy that I haven't lived that I also think could be accurate would be like someone who'd been locked up in prison for a couple of decades. And then they get out of prison and they're overwhelmed with all the choices they now have. I think that is similar to what happens when we get sober, in the sense that, like those choices, our emotions overwhelm us. I remember the second or third day being sober. I usually have a dual monitor set up at my office, and a lot of the time I'll run a small window in one of the outside corners of one of those monitors, and I'll have YouTube running throughout the day, just listening to stuff. And I remember a commercial came on, and it showed a little girl playing with her puppy, and the puppy was licking her face, and it was obvious that the little girl loved the puppy and the puppy loved the little girl. And I was such a raw bundle of emotions that I saw that and I just started crying. And thankfully the office was empty and nobody saw that. But that's how sensitive I was to my emotions back during sobriety. Early sobriety, I should say. As time went on, I got used to actually feeling my feelings, and I also developed tools to cope with those feelings in healthy ways, instead of just shutting them off temporarily. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about how emotions are connected with motivation. So, in the beginning when my addiction was ramping up, maybe the first 12 months or maybe a couple years even, like I said, when I would use, I would actually get happy. But somewhere along the way, it took control of me. Rather than using being something I decided to do sometimes, it became something I had to do. And like I mentioned before, when that happened, I was simply running from my emotions by numbing myself. I have since developed a theory. My theory is that emotions are there to motivate us to change things. What I mean is, I think that in most cases we were given emotions to make us do more of the things that make us feel good and less of the things that make us feel bad. This means that our emotions can spur us on to do more great things, or they can help us solve problems and change our behavior to solve problems, or resolve issues that make us unhappy. For example, let's say that you're unhappy with your job, and you're going to be motivated by the negative emotions associated with that to take action to solve the problem by getting another job. So you wake up in the morning, you go to work, your boss treats you like garbage, you get super pissed, and you're sitting there at 10 a.m. and you're telling yourself, man, as soon as I get home tonight, I'm going to start looking for another job, blah, 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 whatever. And then you go out on lunch and you get high or drunk or whatever you happen to abuse. And then you're heading home at the end of the day and you get high in the car or maybe stop by the bar on the way home. And then, you no longer feel those negative emotions you were feeling at 10 a.m. You're no longer pissed, basically. And suddenly you can deal with the shitty job. It becomes tolerable. And then putting off the job hunt becomes an option. The problem with using to dull and numb emotions is that it takes away the motivation to change your behavior for short periods of time. And then, when the emotions come back, when you start to sober up, you're still in the same place because you haven't done anything to solve the problem. You haven't adjusted your behavior to change whatever is bothering you, or whatever's causing you emotional pain. So as long as you're sober, you'll be motivated to fix it, right? But once you get high or drunk, the emotions, and hence the motivation, is gone. To put it in a succinct sentence, motivation is driven by pleasure or pain. Either you have a pleasurable experience and you're going to pursue that, or you're pursuing avoiding basically a painful experience. Using causes my motivation to occur inconsistently. It allowed me to be motivated, but only in fits and starts. Namely, the only time I was motivated is when I was sober. So here's a good analogy. Imagine a car with a clogged fuel line. And sometimes it gets enough fuel to cruise along at normal speeds. And it could be a clogged fuel line or even a clogged fuel injector, right? And sometimes it gets enough fuel to cruise along at normal speeds. But other times the injector is clogged and you putt along at maybe 5 miles an hour or 2 miles an hour, whatever. Or maybe sometimes the car won't even start. It'll just sit there and try to rev and try to turn over, but never actually turn over. Imagine how long it would take you to make a 300-mile road trip in that condition, right? It's going to take you a long time. This is what using did to my motivation. I can't tell you, in the 17 plus or minus years that I was using, how many times I'd woken up in the morning motivated to accomplish something, and my motivation would hold out until I got high. In fact, I think somebody even wrote a song about that one time. Anyway, my motivation would hold out until I got high, or until I got drunk, or both, and then everything went to shit. My goal for the day could have been working on a car, it could have been doing homework, looking for a job, whatever. And, once I used, then all bets were off. So using would numb my emotions, and this would eliminate my motivation, because then I was okay with everything staying exactly how it was right then. This then led to me not solving problems and resolving issues, or not doing what makes me happy, which then led to hopelessness and unhappiness because you can't solve whatever problem you have or fix it, and that makes you unhappy. So basically, without emotions, it was easy for me to be indifferent. Emotions, for me at least, seem to be the fire that lights under my ass to make me change things. So I'll give you a real life example of this. All this took place in 2018. I changed jobs in May of 2018. I'd been at my previous job for like 5.5 or 6 years. About half of that time I'd been sober. Since I started using back when I was around 16 years old, I had never searched for a job when I was sober. So when I was using, here's what the job hunt would look like. I would basically blast out resumes and applications to as many companies and recruiters as possible. And then I would see what would come back. I'd go on interviews, talk to people, and if something looked good or something looked compelling, meaning they threw enough money at me, I'd take the job. So when I decided to leave my old company, I was clean and I was sober, and I was totally focused and motivated. As a result, I started doing research in December, and then by late January, early February, I had decided I wanted to go to one of two companies, and it was very deliberate and very different from my previous job hunt strategies. I also focused on my motivation, and I started to write down my goals every morning and every evening, and once I wrote them down, I would then read them out loud to myself. This started in December or January, and I kept that up until maybe mid or late April. And what that did was that kept me laser focused on my goals, right? I ended up securing interviews at both companies, and I actually got an offer from the first company, and the second company was writing an offer for me, but I accepted the first because it was more compelling and seemed to make more sense for me. So I put in my notice at my old job. I started at the new company May 1st. That first week, I started moving some of my items and supplies from my home office to the new office. And when I was moving these items, I came across 3 note cards that I had written my goals on. One goal described the type of company I'd be working for. Another described the amount of money I'd be making. And the third listed out the 2 specific companies and roles of the companies that I wanted to acquire, to get, basically. The crazy thing is, all 3 of the goals had been realized and accomplished. Every single one. And I attribute this to the fact that I had consistent motivation. When you write down your goals twice a day and read them out loud, it even becomes a borderline obsession. So that, combined with the fact that I wasn't turning off or numbing my emotions by using, I didn't dull or eliminate my motivation by, using drugs and alcohol. So, like I said before, my theory is this: our higher power, whether you believe in God or the periodic table or whatever, whatever you believe in that accounts for our existence, our higher power gave us emotions. The reason we have emotions is so that we have impetus and motivation to do more of the things that make us feel good and less of the things that make us feel shitty. Now, before I wrap this up, I wanted to take a moment and talk about guilt and shame and regret, since they're emotions. I should actually talk about resentments too. So I'll talk about guilt and shame and regret. I'll take a moment and talk about resentments as well. Due to my background and my nature, I do have a tendency to have negative self-talk. I need to watch this. Regret is something I feel about my past actions. I'm regretful of some of my previous behavior. Another way of saying it is, I wish I hadn't behaved that way, and if I could change that behavior and the results of those actions, I absolutely would. For me, though, regret is not as severe of a feeling as guilt and shame. I reserve guilt and shame for things that I haven't changed yet, or things that I haven't repaired yet. If you do step work, the repair happens when you make the amend. I don't allow myself to feel guilt and shame for things that I've already resolved and made changes on. That way, like I said, the guilt and shame motivates me to change things or make the repair or make the amend. If I allow myself to be shameful or guilty, it can eat me up, and it doesn't feel good, and eventually it could threaten my sobriety. For example, before I got clean, I used to be pretty angry a lot of the time, and I used to lash out at my wife and kids verbally. Am I regretful of those times? Absolutely. Do I wish I could change those incidents? Absolutely. I've made the amend to my wife and also to my children, and it's a living amend. So what that means is, I live the amend by changing my behavior and not going back to my old ways. That's the method by which I make this right. At the same time, though, if I sit there and stew in a pool of guilt and shame, negative emotions, over an extended period of time, that could threaten my sobriety. Because when I'm in an emotional state of pain, my urge is to relieve that pain by using. I think now would be a good time to talk about resentments as well. I worked the steps as part of my program. I worked them out of fear. Basically I saw a bunch of other people who had done step work, and they had acquired what I wanted. Namely, they had acquired and attained their sobriety. So because I was so scared of going back to the way things were before using, after I was like 6-7 months sober, I started doing my step work. And a big part of that is, taking an inventory of all your resentments, and then, cleaning house and addressing those resentments, and I wasn't really, I didn't know what to make of step work in the beginning. Like I said, I just did it out of fear. I did it because I saw all these other people and it worked for them. So I was like, all right, well, I'm scared shitless. This worked for these other people. I'm going to do it. Right. But surprisingly enough, when I got through all my steps and I took an inventory of my resentments and I addressed the resentments and I made all my amends and that kind of thing, it actually provided a level of relief. There were all these things that had been eating me up for years, and I never dealt with them. And then when I dealt with these resentments, like I said, it was almost like I'd been relieved of a burden, like a backpack of rocks that I'd been carrying around for a long time. And, I think that those resentments, what that is, those are symbolic of negative emotion, So I think that when I addressed the resentments, that eliminated a lot of the negative emotion that I was seeking to numb out, by getting high and getting drunk, So if I can cut down on that stuff, then I can cut down on the need and the desire to shut those negative emotions off. What do you think about my theory on emotions being tied to motivation? Does using to turn off or not feel negative emotions sound familiar to anybody out there? Let me know your thoughts or send me questions, feedback, topics you'd like to hear my perspective on. If you want to tell me I'm out of my mind, that's okay too. If you know of anyone who'd be willing to speak with me and tell their story, shoot me an email, let me know. I can be reached at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Also, if you found this helpful, please take some time to share it with others. If you're listening via iTunes, you have the ability to share this from there as a link. I think same thing with Spotify. You also have the ability on iTunes to rate and review this content in the rate and review section. If it's worthy, please take a moment, provide me with a rating and review. That'll help me to, get this content out to other people. So this is written by myself, Louis Vandelay, Vandelay Industries. I also wanted to do a shout out to Doug Snyder for the editing and the audio work. He is the acoustic master of the universe and is a vast source of audio knowledge. Other than that, thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you guys have a great day or a great night or whatever you have. Louis out.